Hi, I'm Phillip Zapkin. I'm a doctoral student at WVU, West Virginia University. I want to first thank John and Jim and the ACES folks, I guess, for putting on this conference and giving me the opportunity to come and speak to you all today. And I'd like to thank you guys for showing up. So the paper that I'm going to present today is entitled Tinker Blood by the Bog of Cats and the Politics of Space in Neoliberal Ireland. And before I read it, I want to mention this is going to become part of my dissertation, which is about contemporary Anglophone adaptations of Greek drama responding to the sociopolitics of neoliberalism. So any constructive criticism would be much appreciated. So again, the paper is Tinker Blood by the Bog of Cats and the Politics of Space in Neoliberal Ireland. In 1987, when Mrs. Thatcher declared that there is no such thing as society, I was going to do a Margaret Thatcher impression and decided not to. Her statement reflected a long-term programmatic commitment of neoliberal ideology, that is, to the isolation of individuals through the destruction of a public sphere built by post-war social democratic governments. By the time of the Celtic Tiger in the mid-1990s, the Republic of Ireland had become a distinctly neoliberal society. However, neoliberal ideological developments were not entirely welcome. Irish neoliberalism included the politicization of space and mobility, which significantly affected Erin's oldest minority, the travellers. Marina Carr's 1998 play By the Bog of Cats adapts the Medea story to critique the social isolation and damage caused by policing space and forcing travellers to settle as unwelcome outsiders in, or more properly on the fringes of, sedentary Irish communities. Now, while this reading of the play is fairly common, I argue for situating Carr's play in a larger context, that she critiques neoliberalism's emphasis on private property as a precondition for subjectivity and citizenship, and the social erosion that results from conceptualizing all people as atomized consumers. Quick sort of summary for those of you who haven't read or seen the play in a while. Carr transculturally adapts the basic plot of Euripides' Medea, shifting it from the heroic age of Greek mythology to the contemporary Irish Midlands. Hester Swain, a traveller now settled on the Bog of Cats, has been abandoned by Carthage Kilbride, who intends to marry Caroline Cassidy. Carr further develops the issue of maternity, already present in the Euripides source text, by exploring not only Hester's relationship with her daughter Josie, but Hester's longing for her own mother, a traveller who left during Hester's childhood with promises to return. Like Medea, Hester kills her daughter at the end of the play, but unlike Medea, who's rescued by a divine dragon, Hester also dies at this play's conclusion. Now, like Medea, transplanted from Colchis to Corinth, Hester is an outsider. Because of her traveller heritage, Hester is regarded by the community with fear, disdain, and suspicions of black magic, even though she is native Irish and lived all her life by the Bog of Cats. As she says, I was born on the Bog of Cats same as all ye's, though you'd never think it the way you shun me. Hester speaks extensively about being an outsider, about feeling ill at ease in her settled life, and about the distrust and hostility she encounters as a child of travelers. Now, this marginality is a common experience of Irish travelers who, like European gypsies, have historically been seen as a dangerous fringe element living by magic, crime, and violence. In a brief social history of the Irish travelers, Michael Hayes notes that prejudice against travelers is entrenched in Irish society. They have a pariah status and live in caste-like isolation. Hayes argues that the main roots of this distrust are suspicions of sexual openness or immorality and a fear of a self-contained culture existing within a mainstream culture. So in other words, because travelers have their own language, customs, religious dogma, and socio-familial organization, they represent an unknowable other which exists as a potential threat to the ostensible unity and coherence of Irish culture. Scapegoating is a common theme in studies of the social role of Irish travelers, but the rise of sedentarism, which is sort of foundational to civilization as we think of it, has provided a strong ideological imperative to isolate and control the movements of nomads. In the essay originally Theorizing Sedentarism, Robbie McVeigh defines the ideology as that system of ideas and practices that serves to normalize and reproduce sedentary modes of existence and pathologize and repress nomadic modes of existence. Or as Maura Wickstrom explains it, sedentarism is a deeply formative attachment to place, to staying in one place, and to a, however unconscious, belief that being itself can only begin, cohere, and persist through being in place. To maintain oneself in place is, of course, dependent upon how one acquires the place in which one is to stay. Hence, sedentarism is joined to ownership of the land of the house. Now, Western civilization is heavily invested in sedentarism as a mode of existence, and therefore unsettled or nomadic peoples pose an existential threat to societies conceptualized through geographic location. Historically, sedentary cultures have invested significant resources in monitoring the locations and activities of groups perceived as having non-geographic identities. So travelers, gypsies, Jews, refugees, and so on. In the neoliberal period, beginning in the late 1970s, policing space and regulating movement has become significantly more important because of increasing globalization. On a fundamental ideological level, neoliberalism seeks to conceptualize all human interactions on a marketplace model and stresses the ethical beneficence of the free market system, because it's great. Under this system, and particularly with the rise of digital communications, the international movement of capital between regional or national markets has become fundamental to global economics. However, so has the control of space and the regulation of who is allowed into certain places. Part of this concern originates with repressed fears about the potentially chaotic aspects of market freedom. As David Harvey puts it, the anarchy of the market, of competition, and of unbridled individualism generates a situation that becomes increasingly ungovernable. And while in theory neoliberalism advocates coupling individual choice with personal responsibility, in practice neoliberal states, including the Republic of Ireland, the US, and the UK, have coupled a pro-corporate or pro-financial climate with increased law and order policies enforced through ideological state apparatuses and ever more militarized police. Of course, travelers have a long and fraught relationship with law enforcement, and it's not just the stereotypical violence and criminality that cause trouble between, especially now, neoliberal law enforcement and travelers. It's the very condition of nomadism. In an article about policing space and traveler culture, Ian Mulcahy writes, "Travelers remain elusive to many of the information demands that mobilize police activities and measure organizational behavior. In more prosaic terms, the need to check names, addresses, and other spatially relevant information is directly undermined by nomadism. Modern police work relies on being able to gather and use information to keep track of people, a system which presupposes sedentary populations. It's much harder to keep track of nomads because at any time they're capable of changing location without warning. For this reason, neoliberal Ireland has sought to impose sedentarism, passing laws that all but outlaw traveling. In her book, Performance in the Blockades of Neoliberalism, Maura Wickstrom documents spatial regulation as a means of disciplining potentially dissident populations in Palestine and the Republic of Ireland. She notes that Irish attempts to end traveling have come to almost total fruition since the Housing, or Traveller Accommodation Act of 2002, also known as the Trespass Law, that effectively criminalized it. The act mandated that any parking or camping on private or public property, including the sides of roads, was illegal. In other words, the nomadic mobility that made traveler culture unique within Ireland has been criminalized. And this criminalization is part of a larger neoliberal project of using identity politics as a means of disciplining increasingly large populations of disenfranchised peoples, the poor, women, ethnic minorities, queers, etc. Lisa Dugan argues that neoliberalism utilizes the rhetorics of identity politics and nationalism to obscure the real role of political and economic power in generating inequality and oppression. She writes that neoliberalism organizes material and political life in terms of race, gender, and sexuality, as well as economic class and nationality, or ethnicity and religion. But the categories through which liberalism, and thus also neoliberalism, classifies human activity and relationships actively obscure the connections among these organizing terms. In other words, emphasizing identity categories de-emphasizes the role of political economics in structuring material and political life in the modern world. McVeigh argues that the enforced sedentarism of travelers constitutes oppression in terms of both identity politics and political economics, writing, "Nomadism is a constituent part of the ethnicity of ethnic nomads. Forcibly to sedentarize them is not simply to stop them traveling, it is actively to destroy their ethnicity." Simultaneously, however, McVeigh argues that sedentary societies police travelers to uphold the legitimacy of property ownership against nomadic peoples who use land without a concept of legal ownership. In McVeigh's theory, nomadism inherently raises questions about the legitimacy of owning land and draws attention to the systems of violence and inequality that undermine sedentarism as an ideology. Now, given the complex positioning of travelers in neoliberal Ireland, as outsiders seen as a moral and economic threat and subject to spatial disciplining, Hester Swain's attitude toward her settled life by the Bog of Cats is understandably complex. Hester's traveler pride exists in tension and sometimes contradiction to her desire to remain settled in her home. She clearly and happily identifies as a traveler, telling Carthage, "As for me tinker blood, I'm proud of it." Despite this pride, however, Hester is ideologically invested in sedentarism, asserting her right to remain in her home against the legal claims of Carthage Kilbride and Xavier Cassidy. She establishes this tie to the geography of the Bog of Cats in the first scene of the play, telling her friend, "I'm going nowhere. This is my house and my garden and my stretch of the bog, and no one's running me out of here." Now, Hester's caught between the almost biological imperative of her tinker blood, a phrase she repeats at least twice, and an ideological imperative tying subjecthood to being in place. This self-division derives from an enforced sedentarism. So, same thing that's going on in contemporary neoliberal Ireland. Except in this case, sedentarism is enforced by Carthage Kilbride, who moved Hester from her caravan to a house. Near the play's end, Hester tells him, "You built that house for me. You wanted me to see how normal people lived, and I went along with you again my better judgment." Now, Hester's identification of normalcy with sedentarism here is extremely important because it reinforces the notion of travelers as exotic other, as distinct and deviant from the Irish norm, and therefore subject to Reformation attempts. In By the Bog of Cats, this Reformation operates primarily on an individual level, with Mrs. Kilbride, who's Carthage's mother, trying to destroy her granddaughter's traveler identity. Mrs. Kilbride, herself the descendant of travelers, ironically, is the most vicious anti-traveler voice in the play. She states directly and unapologetically that she intends to destroy Josie's traveler identity and reform her as a sedentary Irish subject in spite of Hester's continued identification with her familial heritage. Mrs. Kilbride tells the child, "I'll break your spirit yet and then glue you back the way I want you." She envisions the process of raising Josie as literally smashing her identity, an identity infused with her mother's tinker blood, and reforming it as a settled Irish identity. And one of the key debates between Josie and Mrs. Kilbride is whether the girl is a Kilbride, as Josie claims, or a Swain, as her grandmother asserts. And this is not merely a dispute over a name or the legality of marriage, because travelers often identify principally by family. So for Josie to disavow her identity as a Swain is directly to deny her heritage as a traveler. Josie's denial and Hester's ambivalent sedentarism isolate them from a traveler community that might have given them a shared communal identity, and instead locates the mother and daughter in a settled Irish community ideologically invested in property ownership. The debates over Hester's house prove this investment. While Hester asserts a moral right to continue living in the house Carthage built for her, Carthage and the Cassidys claim legal ownership. This agon, or this structuring clash of ethical systems, exposes the socially isolating force of capitalism as it pits consumer against consumer for private possession of resources. In her brief comments about By the Bog of Cats, Maura Wickstrom writes that The traveler is used symbolically, more a means for the playwright to arrive at her own message than an investment in the travelers themselves. Now, I don't necessarily agree that the two descriptions are mutually exclusive, but I do agree that Carr's play has larger ideological stakes than a narrow focus on traveler issues. State-sponsored criminalization of and cultural violence against travelers is one manifestation of larger processes of individual isolation in neoliberal Ireland. The erosion of traveler culture functions as part of a sustained ideological campaign to reformulate identity not along communal lines, but as individual consumers within a social sphere structured by a market mentality. The unity of traveler communities and the threat posed by nomadism to private property ownership necessitates the destruction of traveler identity if neoliberalism is to retain its cultural hegemony, because the travelers embody an alternative form of social organization, one based on family loyalty and nomadic mobility rather than market competition, sedentarism, and late capitalist notions of ownership. Thank you.